I'm interested in comparing now Web3 to Web0, like the kind of bootstrapping of SMTP versus the bootstrapping of protocols today. Um, and SMTP, I mean, took years to bootstrap. What are some of the differences that you're seeing today in terms of bootstrapping infrastructure, bootstrapping core infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a wonderful accident of history that, that the internet was originally came out of academia and government, and and those institutions had built these open protocols, which they'd nurtured for many years, like SMTP and HTTP. You notice though that there's really maybe RSS sort of, but really no kind of open protocols have become dominant in the last 30 years since then. It's just not. And look, I think a lot of it, if you look at it, a lot of it's economics. Like OpenSSL had this famous bug a couple of years ago, right? Which is that's the core team that makes SSL across the internet, sort of the core encryption of the internet. It came out, they had this bug. It came out, they had a half a person working on this critical infrastructure because they had no funding. Now, in that case, people, I think some people stepped up and funded that organization, but it's just generally the problem in kind of open protocols have, if you don't have this sort of incubation from government academia as the Web0 era had, it's very hard to fund these things, right? And how do you compete against, Google has whatever, 130,000 people, I don't know what it is, but some giant number as do all these companies. I think that's why RSS, there was a point in 2007 or so when RSS and Twitter were neck and neck. You go look at the charts, and then Twitter pulled ahead, and I think a lot of it's funding. So one of the big differences with Web3, right, is you now have protocols can get funding. They can have, if you look at ENS, I don't know what it currently is, but they did an airdrop, and that half of the tokens or whatever it was went to the treasury, and at some point at least it was worth billions of dollars. I don't know what it's currently at, but the point just being, this is important, open community controlled infrastructure that now has funding, right? And that's a really big deal, and that means that these protocols can compete on a level playing field. There's also technical advantages. So Web0 protocols were stateless, as they say, like meaning you can't remember anything. HTTP has no memory, right? SMTP has no memory. You can store things at the edges. The clients can store things, but the protocol still has the memory, right? With modern blockchains like Celo, you can store things, and you can run compute, and you can store things. And so architecturally, for the first time, we have kind of community-owned compute and storage. Blockchains, I like to say they're computers in the sky that are owned by no one and accessible to anyone, right? It's a brand new kind of architecture. So I think there's an economic dimension, and I think there's a technical dimension as to why these protocols are kind of dramatically more powerful than previous incarnations.
Yeah, super interesting. And I'll dive in with another question on the economic front, and then I'll jump in with kind of a little more color on the technical front for the audience. But on the economic front, I mean, if you take a look at like SMTP or HTTP, I mean, thank goodness they're open, because they are even bigger monopolies than, say, Google or Facebook. Like everybody. If SMTP were a company, it would be the biggest company in the world. And one can imagine two ways that things can proceed when you add an economic dimension. One is that like the core infrastructure will actually be more of a monopoly because there's more funding behind maintenance of that monopoly. But another way you can think of it is, a lot of these token economic models are predicated on the growth of the protocol. And so once the protocol stops growing, you can imagine that kind of the incentives will start leveling off, and there will be incentives for new upstarts. And so basically it'll allow for a more vibrant a protocol scenario than what we've seen with HTTP and FTP, or HTTP and SMTP. And so which of those two or something else do you see things going? Kind of, this is like a many years in the future question.
To answer that, or Packy? I'm happy to try. So you're saying, will these new protocols sort of re-centralize to monopolistic power?
Will they be even stronger centralized?
Yeah. Well, I think a very key thing to think about is, so why is Facebook, a monopoly essentially, or Instagram, or at least a monopoly within that category. It's because of network effects, right? Because I go on Twitter, let's say, and I build up a following, and I don't want to leave Twitter now because I've spent years building up a following, right? Whereas with Web 1, if I don't like my email provider, I can leave and I can switch my DNS ranking, right? And so the key difference to me is in open protocols, the network effect doesn't accrue to a corporation. The network effect accrues to the community, right? The community owns the network effect. Any user can if there's a centralized provider, they can detach themselves from that provider and move to another one because the network effect exists as a public resource as opposed to a private resource, right? And I think that fundamentally limits the monopolistic power, because network effects are how you become a monopoly on the internet. And it's a network. So the key question to me, and this is getting a little technical, but I think it's a really important thing to understand, is the key question when you talk about monopolistic power on the internet is, where do the network effects accrue? And do they accrue to a public resource like the community, or a private resource? Right. And that's one of the key differences between Web 1 and Web 2. And I believe Web 3 is on the good side of that. But it's early, and it could go off the rails, and it's important that people understand this and also get involved. That people with the right intentions get involved, and it's obviously like a group effort. And so we need to make sure that it actually kind of fulfills the ideals.
Yeah, that's an important and nuanced point. It's why SMTP, even though it's a much bigger monopoly than any Web 2 monopoly, it's not really scary. The only thing that it prevents like newer, more interesting protocols to come into place to replace SMTP, because the network effects are so strong. And I'm going to give a little bit more color to the technical nuance, because I think that's also super interesting. Basically, kind of like Web 1 is, if I were to describe it in one sentence, it would be, or in two words, it would be that it's an open network. Of course, like closed networks existed before. They had a network admin, and they were useful. And the only difference between the internet and these closed networks that existed before was that the internet had no network admin. But in that small difference was the universe, because basically people started making websites for the internet that they wouldn't make for an intranet, because it had it could be taken down, or somebody else might monetize it, or like the whole network might at some point die, whereas that didn't happen with the internet. And so as a consequence of that, everybody started making stuff for the internet. People started making applications for like browsers for the internet that they wouldn't make for intranets, and so on. Similarly, like Web3, the way that I would describe it in two words is as an open database. So closed databases with database admins existed, and they were powerful, and the only real difference is that like the blockchain has no database admin. But in that difference is the universe, because there's now people are building on, and we're seeing the early stages of that, people are building on an open database for the same reasons that they built on an open network. So I want to switch over to, because so many people in the community here are builders, I want to switch over for some advice. Paki, I'd like to direct this question to you. So basically, you do such a great job at narrative, and taking complex ideas and distilling them down to both like verbiage, but also a personality that people understand and can relate to. And so I'm curious, as a lot of people here are entrepreneurs crafting their narrative for their companies, do you have any high-level advice for people who are going along the journey?
Yeah, so I think the first big thing that you need to think about is who you're telling that narrative to. So, I could write the newsletter in a couple of different ways. I could write it very much to crypto insiders, where everyone understands the language and everyone is already on the same page. Or I could write it to people who are maybe a little bit curious, or have started dabbling, or have played around with some things and invested and bought some tokens and started joining some communities, but like really want to understand what's going on beneath the surface. And I go for that community. And then once you decide which community you're speaking to, then you can kind of figure out where they might be in the journey. I mean, for me, I feel like I'm learning all of the time. And so part of the secret is just that I'm exposing what I'm learning in real time in a way that doesn't sound too much like an expert. I think companies in Web2, Web3, anywhere can get too insular and caught up in the way that they describe the thing and the things that they know and take for granted that other people know those things. I also think that they can get a little bit too high-minded, maybe even about the mission. And I think the sweet spot is somewhere right in between, where you can connect this really big thing that you want to do with the details of how you're doing it, but in a way that makes people understand why that's both important to them, important to their community, important to the world around them. I mean, I think, within the seller community, I think the refi movement is a huge example of a place where it's just super ripe for great narrative and storytelling, where all of a sudden you have this toolkit that maybe people don't care about if you're talking about flipping pictures of monkeys or if you're just getting rich by speculating on a token. But people really care about if you can figure out how to align incentives among large groups of people and make sure that the world doesn't burn in the next couple of decades on our watch. And so I think it's really about understanding kind of, the technical side enough to understand what it allows groups of people to do when it's put in the right hands. And so, explaining it to the group of people that you're going after in a way that is both inspiring, but also kind of realistic.
Yeah, I love that. And also, I mean, when I read your writing, it feels so human, so non-institutional. It feels like I'm sitting down and grabbing a beer with you. And have you found how have you basically it feels extremely authentic because and I want to kind of ask, how would you give advice for people to express that same kind of authenticity while describing difficult things?
I think for me, I'm lucky that I'm in this Goldilocks zone of intelligence where there's some people who might just be way too smart to understand how a normal person would think about it. And some people who might just be a little bit too dumb to understand it and explain it. And I'm not that smart, not that dumb, kind of just right in the middle. And so part of it is just that I'm really figuring it out as I go. And so I'm just kind of translating in real time, assuming that most of the people in the room are smarter than I am. I think the thing to do is I started out by almost being a caricature of myself. So the first not borings were, let's take a concept like Schumpeter's Gale, creative destruction from economics, and combine it with the Mickey Mouse Club. So what would have happened if Christina Aguilera and Justin Timberlake and all those talented people were still members of the Mickey Mouse Club today? It would be tragic. So in the beginning of COVID, I wrote a piece about how it's actually maybe a good thing that these companies are shedding a lot of people that maybe they hired when times were too good and people are doing useless jobs. And then over time, I don't use Disney and cartoon characters and whatever to describe it, but I've tried to keep that same tone. So I think almost start out being a caricature of something and then keep the essence as you continue to write and explain yourself.
Yeah, awesome. And Chris, before you were an investor, you were an entrepreneur twice. And I'm curious, there are a lot of people here who are already building their companies. There are a lot of people here who are thinking about what to do. And I want to ask about that pre-company phase. How have you in the past decided to do what you were going to do, what you were going to commit your time and life to?
Yeah, I had this kind of framework. It kind of comes from Peter Thiel, but it's this idea that many startups are what we call earned secrets. So what that means is, let me break it down. Earned means you spent a fair amount of time kind of really studying a problem or working in industry or maybe working in a research lab, whatever it might be. Because many startups do come from kind of years of some kind of experience. And it could just be you're working in the crypto space and you see a lot of problems and things like that. And then why? And then secret why? Because basically, the kind of startup, even if you think about startup ideas, if I said I want to build an iPhone with a better battery life, that's a pretty obviously good idea. And I'm sure Apple's spending billions of dollars working on it, right? And so almost by definition, startups are the things that all of these really well-financed companies are overlooking and think are kind of silly. I have this blog post from years ago. I say the next big thing starts out looking like a toy. And the point just being a lot of really important technologies that started off kind of looking, this really comes from Clay Christensen's disruption theory, but like they start off kind of junky. So like the first telephone could barely go a mile, but then what I think the critics kind of underestimate is the degree to which it's improving. So I just say a couple. So just this is a long conversation, but I'd say a couple things. You know, go deep in an interesting area. Start from problems, not solutions. A mistake I made in my second company is I sort of fell in love with machine learning technology as opposed to my first company, which I think had better product market fit, where I started with a problem. In that case, it was phishing and spyware, and I like knew this was the problem, and then I thought about how to fix it. Start with a problem, you know, go deep in an area. Look for the toy insight is look for things that are that can follow exponential growth curves, and you can ride those things. One of the other mistakes I made, you know, is trying to create a trend versus ride a trend. It's startup is a little dinghy boat on an ocean, and so you know you got to look for where the waves are. You know, clearly, I think the space that we're all in here, the Web3 space, is a giant wave, and that's going to, you know, make a lot of startups more successful. What else? I mean, you know, the single most important thing you can do as an entrepreneur is surround yourself with great people, hire great people, partner with great people, you know, and spend your life kind of looking out for those people and building relationships, for sure. There's a lot of, I could go on and on, but I'll probably stop there.
Well, I mean, I have two kind of follow-on questions to that question. The first is, and this is probably more interesting than directly useful, because I think people's earned secrets kind of have to be their own. But I'm curious, now that you're an investor and you cannot go build your own earned secrets, what are some earned secrets that you'd like to share with the community?
Specific earned secrets? You know, I'm not in that business anymore. I'm in the business of you know, meeting people that have done that and partnering with them. So I don't know if I had those ideas, I'd probably be. But no, I think one of the really important things about investing is that you kind of approach it with some, especially in venture capital, some level of kind of intellectual modesty. And my expectation is that a lot of good ideas won't look good to me at first, and I need to spend time kind of thinking and understanding them. So, you know, so generally, I'm in the trying to understand earned secrets business now. So,
well, you know, it reminds me, the very first social network I ever saw before Friendster, before MySpace, a graduate student. I was a graduate student at Stanford, and a graduate student named Orkut, who was across the hall from me, was working on this social network called Club Nexus. And I remember I went across the hall and I said, "Orkut, what are you working on these days?" And he said, "Look, you can see who your friends are." And I'm like, "Orkut, you need to get out more." And so it's just a reminder of the level of how often really good ideas look kind of silly at the beginning. And Chris, you also talked about product market fit, and you said your first company had better product market fit than your second. And I remember Mark wrote a blog post once about, I forget, it was called something like "Product market fit is the only thing." And so I'm wondering, how do you know when you don't have product market fit? And how do you know when you do? And how do you act as an entrepreneur before you have product market fit versus how do you act after you have product market fit?
Yeah, I think a mistake people make sometimes is they overhire before they have product market fit. Because generally, pre-product market fit, especially if you're a software company, is usually a fairly small team. So like if you look at just all the great software projects in history, like they were like, you know, 10, 20, something like that, not 200, 500. It obviously varies by you know what you're building. If you're building a smartphone or something, you can have more. But so that's one. I think, how do you know it? I mean, it's one of those things you probably, you know it when it happens. You know, there's a famous, it's kind of dated now, but Jeffrey Moore has this famous book, Inside the Tornado, which is all about sort of like once it hits, you're in the tornado, and like generally like your website's going down, you can't fulfill all the orders. If you're building hardware, you know, fail whale, all this kind of stuff. Mark Andreessen likes to say, yeah, if your website's not going down, it's you don't have product market fit, that kind of thing. So you kind of know it, you're just it's like the airplane is, steam's coming out of the front of the car and the thing's rattling and just like everything's breaking, but in a good way, right? So generally that's sort of the you kind of know it when you see it, I think. But if you're not sure, you probably don't fully have it. But it's an iterative process, and you have to kind of, maybe you have product market fit with early adopters, and then at some point you kind of cross over into more mainstream markets. Let's say one last thing. So, Kevin Kelly has this famous blog post, 1,000 True Fans. I think that's another thing, is that it's often better for product market fit to have 1,000 people that love your product than to have 10,000 people that like it. That's another way, is it like those 1,000 people are, passionate. Yep. And then the question is just sort of how do you explain it to more people and spread the word?
Yep. Yeah, I love that. It's so important, and it's so hard to recognize because you tend to be measured by your numbers rather than by the intensity of the how your core community, the intensity of your core community, because the numbers tend to be quantitative and the intensity of the core community is qualitative, but that intensity is actually a predictor of what's going to happen in the future. We have about a minute left, so I'd love to ask each of you, starting with Packy, what are some of the things that you're seeing going forward that you're most excited about in Web3?
I mean, I think a few of mine are, I already mentioned ReFi. I think I've been spending a lot of my kind of investing cycles on the Web3 side there recently. I just think any of these big, hairy, complex coordination problems, we've been practicing an awful lot over the past X number of years, trying different models out, experimenting. And then I think we're going to, over the next couple of years, see those applied to these kind of big, hairy problems. I wrote this piece called The Laboratory of Complex Problems, really saying everything that looks kind of dumb, I guess it is kind of like an addendum to the, the next big thing will start out looking like a toy. All these things that look like dumb experiments are all adding to this canon and this toolkit that people have to go solve really, really big problems. So I don't know, I think to me, that is the most exciting thing. If you just zoom out and take a bigger view on a lot of this, I really think that Web3 is going to help solve a lot of very big problems and build really cool things that, none of us can predict what those are going to be. So that's the thing that I'm always on the lookout for, is on the micro level, what are the really kind of interesting tools and primitives that people are building? And then on the macro level, kind of how might those help solve big problems or do really cool things as humanity?
Awesome. And Chris, what about you?
You said, what am I most excited about Web3?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think it's, I think that the stakes are very high. I mean, it's the internet, I think that the internet's still in a very early phase. And the questions that, the questions that we're discussing are how will this incredibly important invention be architected over the next, whatever decades, 100 years? Where will the money and power flow? Who will control that? So it seems to me, just being, I think to me, it's an incredible opportunity that I can be part of that, and that we all can be part of that, and that we can have this kind of impact. I didn't frankly expect to have this kind of sized opportunity in my career. I lived through the first wave of the internet, and I feel fortunate to be now in this sort of third wave. And I think to me, what's so important is it's a really fascinating technology and products and all the other kind of good stuff, but there's also a mission, right? I think it's an important mission, and that's what really gets me fired up.
Awesome. Well, let's give a round of applause for Chris and Packy. Thank you guys so much. It's a pleasure to connect.